Hello, and thank you for joining us for another Clouded Out audio blog. In today's part 3, we are going to analyze quantitative easing and its effects on the economy as a result of the Great Recession. We will go over what quantitative easing is and the positive and negative consequences of the policy instituted by the Federal Reserve. Throughout the analysis, feel free to comment below with your thoughts of quantitative easing and if you feel the Federal Reserve did the right thing. That said, on to the analysis. What exactly is quantitative easing? Quantitative easing, or QE for short, is the unconventional monetary policy in which central banks purchase government securities or other securities from the market in order to lower interest rates and increase the money supply. Quantitative easing increases the money supply by flooding financial institutions with capital in order to promote increased lending and liquidity. Put another way, the banks buy securities in the form of treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities from their member banks to add liquidity or the availability of money for investment and spending into the capital markets. This method essentially has the same effect as increasing the money supply via money printing. Thusly, the central bank issues a credit to the bank's reserves in order to buy the securities. This credit is essentially created out of thin air, which is why many people refer to QE as money printing. So how exactly does quantitative easing work? Well, first, the Federal Reserve buys mortgage-backed securities and treasuries from banks and securities through the trading arm of the Federal Reserve. Through this buying, it essentially removes these safer investments from the market and pushes down yields on these investments. This forces investors to turn to other assets such as stocks, corporate bonds, and even commodities, pushing their prices higher. The main goal of quantitative easing is essentially lowering the rates on bonds, which will keep mortgages and other consumer rates low and encourage investors to buy assets with higher returns and more risk, such as stocks and corporate bonds. The risk associated with quantitative easing is that the Fed is essentially printing money, which could cause a dollar collapse and spur inflation later on, and many doubt that it will feed through into the broader economy. So why is this money printing process so important to the economy? In short, the purpose of QE is to lower short-term interest rates and increase the money supply in hopes of spurring economic growth. Through these actions, quantitative easing subsequently allows banks to make more loans. According to Amadeo, bank loans stimulate demand by giving businesses money to expand. They give shoppers credit to purchase goods and services. By increasing the money supply, quantitative easing keeps the value of the country's currency low. This makes the country's stocks more attractive to foreign investors, and it also makes exports cheaper. As the federal government auctions off large quantities of treasuries to pay for the fiscal policy, the Federal Reserve then buys those treasuries, leading to an increased demand and keeping treasury yields low. Because treasuries are the basis for all long-term interest rates, it also keeps auto, furniture, and other consumer debts affordable. This additionally keeps long-term, fixed-interest mortgage rates low, an important key to supporting the housing market. So what exactly happened during the Great Recession? Before the recession, the Fed only held between $700 and $800 billion worth of Treasury notes on its balance sheet. By the end of the Fed's QE sessions, they added nearly $2 trillion worth to the money supply. The Fed's balance sheet more than doubled from $2.106 trillion in November of 2008 to $4.486 trillion in October of 2014. There were 5 stages of this quantitative easing process from December of 2008 to December 2013. Yes, the recession was deemed to have ended in 2009 by the FOMC. However, the economy was far from recovered, which is why the QE continued long after 2009. It is said that the U.S. Federal Reserve undertook the most successful QE effort. QE achieved some of its goals, missed others completely, and created several asset bubbles. All 5 stages of QE will be explored, as well as their successes and failures. While far from a free market principle, it is crucial to understand how the Fed is using Keynesian-style government intervention to leverage money and/or money manipulation against the United States and world markets, as well as against consumers in the U.S. market economy. First round of quantitative easing ranged from December of 2008 to June of 2010. A year after the recession started, the Fed had already maxed out all of their primary monetary policy tools. The interest rates were near zero, and the Fed was scrambling for how to further combat the financial crisis of 2008. However, with no other choice, the Fed announced it would purchase $800 billion in bank debt, U.S. Treasury notes, and mortgage-backed securities from member banks. By the time 2010 hit, the Fed had bailed out the collapsed banks of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac by buying out $174 million worth of mortgage-backed securities. Furthermore, it bought $1.25 trillion of additional mortgage-backed securities in an effort to help banks by taking these subprime mortgage-backed securities off their balance sheet. This large buying spree, or bailout of privately owned banks, had more than doubled the Fed's holdings. During this time, the Fed also bought $300 billion worth of long-term Treasury bonds, which ultimately gave the government more money to spend. In June of 2010, the Fed stopped buying because it was deemed that the economy was growing. However, just 2 months later, the economy started to decline again, a fake recovery. And the Fed renewed the program, buying $30 billion worth of Treasury bonds per month to keep their holdings near $2 trillion. Although there were some shortcomings, the first round of quantitative easing was successful enough to help prop up the fall in housing market with low interest rates. The keyword here is prop up. This leads to the second round of quantitative easing, which took place from November of 2010 to June of 2011. Though QE1 was considered successful, the U.S. recovery was still patchy, entailing the economy hadn't truly recovered just yet. The equity markets were above their 2009 lows by 50%, however the unemployment rate remained at 9.8%. The goal of the second stage of QE was to shore up bank liquidity and lift inflation. To do this, the Federal Reserve bought $600 billion worth of additional treasuries. Their hopes were that it would induce mild inflation, but just enough to spur demand, and in the end, many regarded that QE2 was relatively well received, with most economists noting that while asset prices were propped up, the health of the banking sector was still a relative unknown. It was less than 2 years since the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, and with confidence still low, it was prudent to promote investment through cheaper money. Again, QE2 was well received by many, but the effects were marginal in the bolstering of the economy, a result of man trying to control that which has its own mind. Needless to say, nearly 1 year later, the Federal Reserve was forced to invoke its third session of quantitative easing. However, before QE3, the Fed had another plan of its own concoction, Operation Twist. Operation Twist, which ran from September of 2011 to December of 2012, was the Federal Reserve's additional monetary policy involving the further buying and selling of Treasury bonds. It received its name due to the visual effect that the monetary policy action was expected to have the shape of the yield curve. The yield curve twists when short-term yields go up and long-term interest rates drop at the same time. This Operation Twist was informally known as Operation Screw to many Americans, especially Peter Schiff, who scorched the Fed in saying that what they were essentially doing was screwing over the American people. He said that if you own dollars, you're screwed. If you own bonds, you're screwed. If you have a savings account, you're screwed. If you're an American working for wages or salaries, you're collecting a paycheck in dollars, you're screwed. If you're hoping to retire on dollars, you're screwed. So how exactly did the Fed increase short-term interest rates and lower long-term interest rates? Seeing that the Fed was already faced with near zero federal funds rates, they were forced to sell short-term treasuries and buy long-term treasuries. To better explain this strategy, the Fed sold short-term treasury securities and bought long-term treasuries, which pressured the long-term bond yields downward, thereby boosting the economy. As short-term treasury bills and notes matured, the Fed would use the proceeds to buy long-term treasury notes and bonds. The effect on short-term interest rates was minimal, as the Fed had committed to keeping short-term interest rates near zero for the next couple of years. During this time, the yield on the 2-year bonds was close to zero, and the yield on 10-year bonds, the benchmark bond for interest rates on all fixed-rate loans, was only about 1.95%. In addition to the Treasury manipulation, the Federal Reserve also stepped up their purchases of mortgage-backed securities of nearly $40 billion per month, resulting in over $600 billion before the conclusion of the operation. However, after all this buying, selling, and manipulation of market factors, it did not appear to solve the problem. Thomas supports this claim in conjunction with Bloomberg as they found that in the financial community, Operation Twist was generally seen as being too weak to improve the economy or bring down the unemployment rate. The news service Bloomberg reported results of a poll of 42 economists, of which 61% said the program would have no effect, and 15% thought it would actually inhibit the economic recovery. Throughout this period, the economy remained sluggish, unemployment was still relatively high, and the low interest rates did little to increase the demands for loans. However, the one area of the economy that recovered robustly during the period was the stock market. As a result of this failed operation, before the conclusion of Operation Twist in December of 2012, the Fed ratcheted up another round of quantitative easing for the third time, in hopes to better stimulate the economy. Nothing like tripling down on a failed strategy. Sounds awfully like the definition of insanity. The third round of quantitative easing took place between September of 2012 and October of 2014. At this point, many were not fond of hearing about the third round of quantitative easing. Economists said the balance sheet had expanded to an already lofty level, and it was time to seek alternative strategies. But the Fed was more concerned with doing more of the same, doubling or tripling down on their already overreaching strategy. The Federal Reserve continued Operation Twist and agreed to buy an additional $40 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities, adding a total of $85 billion worth of liquidity on a monthly basis. Additionally, according to Amadeo, the Fed did three things it had never done before. It announced that it would keep the federal funds rate at zero until 2015. It said it would keep purchasing securities until jobs had improved substantially. It acted to boost the economy, not just to avoid a contraction. The Fed was trying to do everything it could to bolster job growth and increase lending, though few saw the benefits of their actions. Therefore, it was expected and understandable that there were many critics of the Fed. Hurt stated as such. Some economists note that previous easing measures have lowered rates, but done relatively little to increase lending. With the Fed buying securities with money that it essentially created out of thin air, many also believe it leaves the economy vulnerable to an out-of-control inflation once the economy fully recovers. This leads to the fifth and final stage of quantitative easing monetary policy held by the Federal Reserve, which took place between January of 2013 and October of 2014. The fourth round of quantitative easing was essentially an extension of QE3, thus the confliction with the dates. Some refer to QE4 as QE3 for this reason, and others call it QE infinity because the Fed did not have a definitive end date. In December of 2012, the Fed called an end to Operation Twist and indicated it would continue to buy $85 billion worth of long-term treasuries and mortgage-backed securities each month until one of two conditions were met. Either unemployment fell below 6.5% or inflation rose above 2.5%. On December 18, 2013, the FOMC announced it would be tapering down on QE3 or QE4, indicating it would reduce the rate it was purchasing treasuries and mortgage-backed securities at a rate of $10 billion per month with each of its bi-quarterly meetings, $5 billion for each asset class. However, it wasn't until October of 2014, 10 months later, that the program was finally halted. Though quantitative easing had ended, and it allowed for cheaper loans, lower housing rates, and a devalued dollar, all of which spurred demand and as a consequence, lower unemployment, it led to a hugely offset economy from the norm. So what were the consequences of quantitative easing? The end of QE came because the Fed hit three of its economic targets. The unemployment rate was at 7%. GDP growth was between 2 and 3%, and the inflation rate had not exceeded 2%. Despite meeting these targets, that did not mean that the economy was completely recovered. The FOMC would continue to keep the federal funds rate between 0 and 1/4 points until 2015, and below 2% through 2016. The Fed had doubled its holdings of securities, both Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, from $2.1 trillion to $4.5 trillion, as can be seen in the graphs below. Additionally, the Fed affirmed it would replace these securities as they came due to maintain their holdings at these levels. Nevertheless, on June 14, 2017, the FOMC announced it would start reducing their holdings. They initiated a reduction of $6 billion worth of Treasury bonds per month and will continue reducing $6 billion per month additionally until they were retiring at least $30 billion per month. Furthermore, they followed a similar procedure for reducing their mortgage-backed securities of $4 billion per month until totaling $20 billion per month. However, they indicated that this change won't occur until the federal funds rate reaches at least 2%. So the following is a list of all the positive that is deemed to have resulted from QE. Quantitative easing essentially removed toxic subprime mortgages from the bank's balance sheets. This restored trust and allowed for further banking operations to continue. It also helped stabilize the United States economy by providing funds and confidence to pull out of the recession. It maintained low interest rates, which boosted consumer spending and revived the broken housing market. It stimulated economic growth in the form of GDP. And there was no widespread inflation, for the reasons discussed below. And now a list of all the bad side effects that occurred because of QE. Firstly, it gave money to the banks instead of the people, who sat on the funds instead of lending them out. Banks used excess funds to prop up stock market prices through dividends and stock buybacks. In 2009, the banks had their most profitable year. Banks consolidated their holdings. 0.2% of the banks controlled over 70% of the bank assets. This is the first time in history that the Fed owned privately secured mortgage-backed securities, meaning they actually owned people's homes. A lid was put on inflation instead of letting the market correct itself. Because the banks did not lend out money, businesses could not hire workers or increase operations. Though this would have fueled demand and drove prices up, the effects of QE with regards to inflation were virtually hidden and suppressed, but that does not mean that they will simply go away. The inflation was instead stuffed into a series of asset bubbles. In 2011, the commodity traders turned to gold, and that drove the price from $869.75 in 2008 to $1,895 per ounce of gold. In 2012, with the announcement that the Fed was buying treasuries, caused investors to additionally turn to U.S. treasuries. This drove the yield of the 10-year treasury notes to a 200-year low. In 2013, the Fed announced it was tapering their buying of treasuries. This caused investors to jump ship, triggering a massive selling spree. This selling led to a spike in interest rates, and the Fed was forced to hold off on their plans. Instead, investors went from treasuries to the stock market, leading to a 24% boost in the Dow. Though many felt that the Fed did what it was supposed to do, creating credit for the financial markets when liquidity was severely constrained, it couldn't control Congress's actions of cutting government spending or raising tax cuts in the form of contractionary fiscal policy. The Fed could not force banks to lend out the money, and it created bubbles in other assets without getting needed funds to households or businesses. So since the end of QE, where does America stand in terms of economic prosperity? It is currently mid-2018, and interest rates have yet to hit 2%. And because of this, the Fed is not selling off any assets that they have required during the QE process in order to lower their balance sheets. Historically, it has been seen that every 10 years there is a new recession. However, it has almost taken 10 years to dig out of the hole from the last recession. Despite the FOMC claiming that the recession ended in 2009, the Fed was still heavily manipulating the entire system to fight the effects of a true economic rebuilding. While many consider the Fed's actions as helpful to pull through the recession, what damage has it caused for the future? The long-term effects of adding trillions of dollars worth of government debt and leveraging treasuries and mortgage-backed securities to create liquidity out of thin air have to go somewhere. Since the recession, the United States has seen record-high stock markets, yet extremely low interest rates and cheap money. The stock market bubble will pop, and it will likely bring inflation with it. Something in that mix does not make sense, and when the chickens come home to roost, who is going to bear this burden? The taxpayers. The taxpayers who have their retirement in the stock market and in US dollars. As can be seen in the graphic below, both the government and Wall Street have been selling off their treasury holdings, leaving individuals amassing high percentages of them. If the bond market bubble bursts, it is the American people who are going to go under. Furthermore, the Fed has shifted all of this money creation and greed from the banks, who were bailed out and received this newly created money, to we the people in the form of government debt, going from nearly $9 trillion in 2009 to over $20 trillion today. How is it that Americans should be forced to pay for the risk and mismanagement of bankers so they can walk out with briefcases of money and leave we the people holding the bag? It is far from fair, and it could be said that the Fed is far from providing we the people a proper service. Instead, it has felt they are in cahoots with big banks and government, and look to everyday Americans to bear the burden. The Fed claims they are there to serve the citizens of the United States, but perhaps that is smooth talk for cover the check. The fear is that when asset bubbles burst and the inflation comes back to haunt Americans, what can be done? Americans are going to be left with no retirement, no savings, an inflationary currency, and unable to provide for themselves or their families. Though the Fed is made up of smarter people than we the people, it is doubted that the Fed is smarter than the will of the market. What America needs is a way out of this system, to let the market become free again, without Keynesian principles and government manipulations holding Americans hostage and responsible for the Fed's actions. If the Fed would stop pulling its levers in holier-than-thou fashion and return to free market principles, the U.S. dollar would retain its integrity and the government would not be allowed to spend away the lives of their children and their children's children. The common denominator in this whole debacle of QE and the Fed's actions are big banks, and doubling and tripling down on failed policy. Give the free market a try before flushing what little remains of U.S. integrity down the toilet. In the next video, we'll look at the federal debt. As the Fed has created more money out of thin air, the government has spent more money that it didn't have. With that, a tremendous increase in the amount of debt has been a result, and it is likely going to cause many more problems in the future. We thank you for joining us and spending a piece of your day here at Clouded Out. We hope that you learned something, as we are here to inform and educate and analyze. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Again, thank you for your time, and have a great day. You can read this article, along with many others, as well as see their sources on cloudedout.com. To be notified of our blog posts, you can subscribe on cloudedout.com, or you can follow us on a variety of other social media platforms, such as Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and Minds.com. The links are down below in the video description. If you have any comments about this video, comment below. We'd love to hear what you have to say. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you would like to be notified when new videos are posted, please subscribe and enable notifications. All of this helps YouTube know that this is quality content that you like and enjoy, and it will recommend videos like these to viewers like you. Stay tuned for the next video, and we look forward to seeing and hearing from you in the future. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay informed.